Okay, so now let's talk about the goals of the economy. So these are called the macroeconomic goals, and the purpose of these macroeconomic goals is the aim of the government to try to increase our living standards, and the way that they try to do this is by trying to achieve the economic goals. So first goal is the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. So in this goal, what the economy is trying to do is they're trying to make sure that our real GDP grows sustainably. So it's growing first, so it's going strongly. There's an upward trend in real GDP. Secondly, it's sustainable. So despite the upward trend, we don't want it to increase to a significant level. Next is the goal of price stability. So the goal of price stability is all about how about keeping prices stable, pretty much. So this one relates to inflation. So here, this goal is all about keeping inflation in check. So we want inflation, but we don't want too much of it, just because we want to keep it stable. Otherwise, it's unsustainable. Next is the goal of full employment. So we're not trying to achieve no unemployment at all, but we're trying to achieve a rate of unemployment that's good for the economy, but not such a high rate of unemployment that it's bad for the economy. So we want sort of the sweet spots for each of them, and I'll discuss those in a bit. But these goals, really, really important. So from Unit 3 to literally the end of the year, you're going to be focusing a lot on these economic goals. So how do we measure the price level in the economy? We use inflation to do that, and that refers to a goal of price stability. So definition of inflation, it's just a sustained increase in the average price level over time. So the way that we measure inflation, we use the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. And this is pretty much where the Australian, so the ABS, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they survey metropolitan households, so a very small percentage, I think just 2%, to sort of investigate what goods they buy, what goods they use the most, and then weigh them, and then determine inflation. Here we go. So it's a basket of consumer goods, and they're weighed according to their importance to the consumer. So remember, 2% of metropolitan household. So immediately we can see a problem there. If it's only 2% of households, it doesn't give us an indication of what rural households want. It's a very small proportion of the economy, so it might not always be right. Okay, so the goal of price stability. Usually I don't say memorize things in Echo, but if you were to memorize anything, memorize these 3 goals. So the goal of price stability is pretty much to achieve an inflation rate of 2 to 3% per annum, as measured by the CPI on average over time. So I'm just going to get this pen out, and I'm going to highlight the very important things I want you to say. So first of all, rate of 2 to 3% per annum. So per annum, 2 to 3%, measured by CPI, that's another important thing to add. And then this is really, really, really important. So remember, price stability is a sustained increase in price. It's not just a one-off spike in prices and they go down. It's like a sustained increase in prices on average over time. Why does the government want to do this? First of all, if the inflation is too high, if the prices are going way too quickly, we sort of stop becoming internationally competitive. So that means that our prices start to be really high and we don't sell as many exports anymore. So that's bad for our aggregate demand. Next, we want to make sure that our currency maintains its purchasing power. So again, related to international competitiveness, as people buy products from us, we have more purchasing power with that currency as well. So you'll talk a lot more about this a bit later on when you discuss trade and everything as well. Second, why don't we want zero inflation? It literally means that prices are low, they're not rising, and it sort of makes the economy look a bit weak as well, because usually a small amount of inflation is a good thing. It shows that we're going good, demand is strong in the economy as well. Okay, next let's do an example. So let's say the CPI is 100, and then in the next year it's 104. What is the final rate of inflation? Literally new minus old divided by old. That's it. So new is 104 minus old 100 divided by old divided by 100. That's 4%. So the maths in Echo is pretty straightforward. How do we measure economic growth? So now this is our second goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. And the purpose of this goal is just to make sure that we've got a strong, sustained increase in real GDP every year. So we're growing with that real GDP. So remember, real GDP or GDP means gross domestic product, which is the total value of production in the economy. So for example, if we have 500 ice cream produced in 2018, GDP is 500. But we also just learned that prices are increasing over time. So our normal or our nominal GDP is not quite accurate. So as prices are increasing, we're going to get false indication of the GDP increasing, even if we actually don't produce more. So let's say in 2019, Atal Land produces 500 ice creams, but the price is actually $2 each. The GDP is going to be 1,000, so 500 times 2. But the amount of ice creams they produce is exactly the same. So to be honest, we haven't increased the amount we produce. We've just increased the value of what we produce. So that's where real GDP comes in. Real GDP is a measure of GDP where inflation, the effects of inflation is pretty much discounted. So we're not going to talk about how that's done, but just remember that real GDP gives us a better indication about the amount, the volume of production. So yeah, real GDP is the one that we really use. Okay, so the government's goal for strong and sustainable growth is to try to achieve a rate of 3 to 4% average growth in real GDP per annum on average over time. Okay, here I'm going to highlight the key things again. So growth rate of 3 to 4% in real GDP per annum. And then on average over time, you don't really need that for real GDP, but I'd include on average as well, just to be safe, just to make sure I get all the marks. Why do we want to do this? So if we have a very high GDP, so within that goal, it means that we have more income, so more people employed, more access to goods and services, better material living standards. So obviously if we're producing more, we're hiring more people, there's more employment. More employment means that the incomes are higher and more people are able to afford different goods and services, so higher material living standard. We are close to a maximum productive capacity, so that keeps unemployment low. Why do we not want, let's say, 10% growth in real GDP? That usually results in very, very high inflation. So accelerates inflation. It's not sustainable. And we have limited capacity as well. So remember our productive capacity. We can't really fund that growth. We can't really achieve that growth with our limited productive capacity. So we want to make sure that the growth is strong, but we also want to make sure it's sustainable so that we can actually sustain that growth for a long period of time. So let's do an example. Let's say the real GDP was 500 in 2017 and it's 570 in 2018. What's the rate of growth? Again, new minus old divided by old. So that's 570 minus 500 divided by 500. So new minus old divided by old, that's 14% growth in real GDP. So too high. Next, last goal is all about the goal of full employment. So what does it mean? So the goal of full employment, the purpose of this is pretty much to be employed, you need to be first of legal working age, so 15 or older, do more than 1 hour of paid work per week. So again, the definition is pretty loose. So as long as you do 1 hour work every week and you're paid for it and you're over 15, you're considered employed. So this means that literally you don't have to work a lot to be fully employed. But that doesn't mean that everyone else who's not considered employed is unemployed. That's actually not the case. That's where it gets a bit confusing. Unemployed is not the same as not employed. It's completely different. So to be unemployed, we have a very clear definition. A person needs to be of legal working age, so at least 15. They should be willing and able to work. They need to be actively seeking employment. So there's like a number of minimum job interviews, job application they should be doing, and they should be working less than 1 hour a week or not working at all. So it's a very, very strict definition. So there's quite a few people who are not employed, but they're not classified as unemployed because they don't meet all the conditions of this. So why are people unemployed? There's quite a few reasons of unemployment. So I'll cover them one by one. So firstly, there's structural unemployment. So this is pretty much where people have skills, but they don't really match what employers want. So for example, if there is, for example, let's say the car industry, let's say you're an amazing car manufacturer, but there's really no car industry in Australia. So in Australia, you are very likely to be structurally unemployed just because your skills, they're amazing skills, but they're not really what is in demand in that economy at that time. Seasonal unemployment. So again, this is very straightforward. It's really dependent on the season. So seasonal unemployment refers to being unemployed because of what season we're in, or just because of seasonal changes. So an example of that is, let's say you're a mall Santa. So let's say you sit at a shopping center and you take pictures with kids dressed up as Santa. Now, that's really great. You're going to make amazing income during November, December, during Christmas time. But at all other parts of the year, people are going to give you weird looks, and no one's really going to hire you to be a mall Santa. Another example is, let's say, ski instructors. So obviously it only snows in winter. If your skill is to be a ski instructor, there's really no demand for you in summer just because your job just doesn't exist in summer. Next is frictional unemployment. So this is pretty much for people who are sort of temporarily unemployed because they're shifting between jobs. The way that I like to remember frictional is shifting between jobs. If you move, there's friction, and if you're shifting, that means that you are frictionally unemployed. So that's an example. An example of that is, let's say you send in your notice for your job, you stop working, and then 2 weeks later you're going to work at your new job. For those 2 weeks, you're frictionally unemployed. Next is hardcore unemployment. So this is for people who have, certain characteristics or certain qualities that make it very hard for them to find a job. So an example of that is maybe a criminal history. So employers might be less willing to employ people with a criminal history, and they might be more likely to be hardcore unemployed. Another example is just, let's say you're an unpleasant person to work with. People might be less willing to work with you just because your personality is not great to work with. So yeah, that's hardcore unemployment. Lastly, is cyclical unemployment. So the reason why it's in red is all of these blue ones are unrelated to the business cycle. So there's sort of stuff that happen regardless of how demand is in the economy or how supply is. But cyclical unemployment is unemployment that comes about only because of low levels of demand in the economy. So this is something we really want to avoid. We want to avoid cyclical unemployment just because it shows that the economy is not doing as strongly as it could be doing. So our goal for full employment, so the Australian goal for full employment is to get rid of cyclical unemployment and also achieve an unemployment rate of around 4 to 5%. So I know it says 5%, but it's actually 4 to 5%, as close as possible to NAIRU. So NAIRU is non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It's a bit of a mouthful. But the meaning of that is just, we want to get an unemployment where we're not having people earn so much that they're spending way too much and they're full on causing crazy inflation. So that's pretty much what NAIRU is. It's just a complicated way of saying that. So it's literally the lowest rate of unemployment we can have without running into excessive inflationary pressures. Okay, full employment can be confusing just because, especially with employment, there's like a very stringent definition. So not employed is not being unemployed is not the same as not being employed. So it's just something to realize. So a way that we can look at it is we have an entire population, then we have a population over 15 who are of legal working age. Out of that, we have the labor force. So this is the population of over 15 who are both willing and able to work. So not everyone over 15 is willing and able to work, and not the entire population is over 15. Next, we have people who are willing and able to work who are now employed. So they work for a minimum of an hour every week and they're paid for that. So that's pretty much how employment works. So let's do an example. So let's say there are 1,000 people living in ATAR land, and 800 of them are over 15 years old, and 500 are employed, 100 are unemployed. The labor force is the number of people who are employed and unemployed. So that's 500 plus 100, which is 600. So it's not 800 because not everyone over 15 is willing and able to work. Participation rate, so that is the labor force divided by population over 15. So it's literally the proportion of the population over 15 that's willing and able to work. So 600 over 800, that's 75%. Unemployment rate, that's the number of unemployed people, so 100 divided by the total labor force. That is 16.7%.